Hi, welcome to Get Lit. My name's Pete Crooks. I'm senior editor and senior writer at Diablo Magazine. We're here at the Walnut Creek Library where we interview local authors about their work and about the value of public libraries. And today we have a very, very special guest, the author of The Street of a Thousand Blossoms, Gail Tsukiyama. Welcome to Get Lit.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here. This book means so much to Walnut Creek because it was picked in 2010 as the choice for the One City, One Book program. Yeah. When your book is, appreciated in a broad readership like that, what does that mean to you as an author as far as reaching that large of a group?
It's always a surprise because I spend so much time by myself working, and you never know during the writing process if anybody will read the book. I mean, you know, but you don't know kind of feeling. So I'm always in that state of, if I write this story and I love this story, I'm hoping somebody else will love it. And I've been really fortunate in this area that Walnut Creek has been a love fest for me in the sense that the readers have always embraced the books. So when they chose Street of a Thousand Blossoms, it was like coming home to a large extent, that I wrote the right book for the audience that has always appreciated the work. And that makes the writer feel just, that you've done what you wanted to do.
That's wonderful to know that you appreciate the recognition. Because I am very curious about that relationship that you have creating this piece of work, creating these characters, fleshing it all out so it makes sense to the reader who doesn't have the background and research that you've done, that you've put into it. So that connection you get to the one reader who does open the book and start on page one and get sucked into your story. Are they in your mind during the writing process? How does, are you connecting to the reader as you're putting the words on the page is my question.
I think it's several things going on simultaneously, and a lot of it is in your subconscious. It's an unconscious process. You have in the forefront the story that you're trying to work on, the characters that you're trying to develop. And when I first turn on the computer, I feel a lot of people sitting on my shoulder. I feel the editor, I feel the agent, I feel my readers, I feel myself to a certain extent. And then something happens and everybody sort of takes the background and disappears, and the story comes to the forefront. But I think ultimately I'm the reader. I write a certain amount and then I go back and I read it. And I read as a reader as much as a writer. And I feel like if I can get it, I'm hoping the reader will get it. And I'm always writing about periods of time where I don't know a lot about it. And so there's a great deal of research involved before I even begin writing. And so what I hope to do is not only tell a story that a reader will be interested in, but to impart some of the history and some of the information and some of the things that I'm curious about into the book that I can answer the questions. So the process is so multitask. I don't even realize I'm doing it until I just start doing it, and then I kind of get in that zone of trying to cover a wide space at the same time.
That's fascinating, and you touched on so many things in that response that I had been curious about before the interview began. The idea of writing about periods of history where you weren't alive in pre-war Japan, you didn't exist to have that sort of tangible sense of what that place was. So what is required, in your imagination and in your in your research to create that period of time as if it's real?
At first I always believed that the research was kind of a security blanket for me at the same time as being the author, the writer, who created imaginary characters and imaginary worlds, but placed them in something solid, like the reality of something that happened in history, in historical times. And I think that had a great deal to do with my very first novel, Women of the Silk. I thought, well, I'd like to kind of explore some part of my own heritage, but I don't want to write about myself. And I certainly was not going to write about relatives who were still alive at the time. So I thought, what if I go back in time a little and I try to explore the reasons that I'm here today in the Bay Area and in the present day. What got me here? And that's what began the whole idea of kind of setting a book back in time. It wasn't primarily going to be women's issues that I was going to write about, but certainly I was drawn to the fact of how did Chinese women live, 100 years ago, turn of the century, and what was it like in the southern part of China, because I was raised in the Cantonese culture, and I understand it, but I don't speak the language well. Mm-hmm. So, you grab onto the little instances that are from your own life, and then you start slowly stepping backwards and grabbing onto things that kind of fit into the understanding of your own life. And that's what I had done. I thought, okay, I'm going to start researching now this period of time. And I was, and still am, a huge library girl. A lot of my research takes place in libraries and books. And I remember especially Women of the Silk and the Samurai's Garden spending a great deal of time in libraries.
Which libraries did you go to research those?
The Berkeley Main Library in Shattuck, the small little El Cerrito Library, any library I could go to. I went to hoping to find information. So I just went and started reading everything I could find on China. And then I thought, China has a long history. I need to narrow this down. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I began to do. I said 1900 and forward. Southern part of China, this, that. And I was able to kind of grasp it much better. And it was a first book, so I didn't know what I was doing half the time.
That's right. My question is, Women of the Silk came out in 1993?
Yeah, it could have been earlier, 91.
So 20 years ago. And the amount of time that you invested to put that book together.
Exactly, was 5 years prior to that.
Late 80s.
Yeah.
Reagan was president of the U.S.
No wonder I wanted to jump in.
So especially as a first book, that's a head-first dive into 5 years of your life that you don't know how that book's going to come together, because you probably didn't have the confidence in your process that you have now.
Yeah.
And exactly you just don't know if
but I didn't expect to be published.
You didn't expect to?
No, I wanted to write a story that had a beginning, middle, and end as a test for myself. Could I do it? Prior to that, I wrote a lot of short stories. I got all my degrees in creative writing, but the emphasis was poetry.
Okay.
So it was kind of climbing the ladder in terms of the writing process for me. Could I do this? I made it more difficult by choosing, a historical content that I wanted to put my characters into, because it meant dealing with all this other material that I needed to put my fictional characters in. At the same time, it was that security blanket I was looking for. Half of the story was there because I had this. But I didn't know if it wanted to be fiction or nonfiction. Mm. And I had this process of writing half a book and then going back and reading it and seeing how it would read for me as a reader reading it, mm-hmm. not as a writer reading it. And that's when I realized I had done it all wrong. And I started all over again.
Back to the drawing board.
Back to the drawing board.
Wow.
Yeah.
So as an ambitious creative person to just take on this project for yourself, what kind of satisfaction came from publishing the book and having people respond to it?
That, to this day, I would say, when they ask, well, what's one of the three greatest things about being a published author? And I will never forget the day when that first book, they sent you the first hardcover mm-hmm. in the mail before the book actually comes out in a big way. And I remember taking out of the envelope and thinking, oh my God, it really happened. And the fact was, I didn't think it was going to happen. And I was writing at a very good time. It was to be an Asian American woman author. Amy Tan had written the Joy Luck Club. Mm-hmm. Suddenly all the doors swung open, and they wanted an Asian American woman author. I always think to this day, if I had written the book 10 years prior, it might not have been published. And that's why it always feels like such a gift when I think back. Because at that time, it was such a huge time for third world voices to come in. And the door hasn't closed since then, which meant that finally the time had come when people would publish other stories from other places. And that's why I always felt that it was such a really lucky time for me to be a writer, regardless if I knew I was going to be published or not.
That's interesting, that some of it's the fate of timing.
I always believe, I'm a huge believer of superstitions of fate.
So we talked about how you can research history and go back in time in your imagination and through your work.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the nonfiction history of Gail. Like, where did you start your journey?
Born in San Francisco, have lived in the Bay Area my entire life. Then we moved over to the Berkeley side. And so I've stayed in this area, love this area. I think it's been so great in terms of the melting pot that we have in the Bay Area. You know, I've never felt that I was apart from anyone, which is why I find it strange. I mean, I'm pretty much the typical American kid, but had a Chinese mother from Hong Kong and a Japanese father from Hawaii. So I was really brought up in the Chinese culture because my mother came over for college, and eventually all the side of her family came over, and we've all lived in the Bay Area. So I grew up hearing Chinese, Cantonese, grew up experiencing all the cultural events of the Chinese culture, and didn't know much about the Japanese culture growing up. And it wasn't until I began writing and began my second book, The Samurai's Garden, that I really kind of dived into the Japanese side of my culture, which is another great thing about being a writer, is that you really can satisfy your curiosities. You really learn not only about life, but certainly about yourself. So I was able to do a lot of discovering of my own culture as well as the culture as a whole. But the funniest thing was that here I was growing up in the Chinese culture all my life, and realizing as the more I read about the Japanese culture and the art and the language and all the subtleties of the Japanese culture, I realized I was very much Japanese. Mm-hmm. And so to make the transition from writing the Chinese culture into the Japanese culture, my greatest fear was, am I going to get the culture right? Mm. Because they are similar and then they're very different. So I started writing, and the more I read, the more I felt if I could translate what it meant to be in Japan at that time, discovering the culture through the eyes of a young Chinese man who was in there, in a way, in effect, it could be me discovering the culture. And so that's when I felt more comfortable about it, you know. And so every book is a different process. And when you're coming from two different cultures where you're trying to place that culture into the storyline, you can't help but find out a lot about yourself also, you know. But ultimately, I always have felt the American kid, and yet I've never really written about being the American kid.
Is that ever on the horizon?
I don't know. I mean, I would hope so. I mean, you'd think that you'd live your daily life, and yet it seems in a way when I'm sitting down to write, it's much easier for me to write about something I don't know.
That's fascinating.
Than something that I know too well.
So, but that seems like good advice for aspiring writers to really know the material and write for your own experience, and that hope that will translate to an audience rather than question whether or not.
Well, you know, we grow up. I mean, we go through the writing departments, and we have professors who tell you write about what you know. Mm-hmm. I'm sure a lot of writers out there have heard that, and I think I did the opposite. Mm-hmm. I wrote about everything I didn't know, but it really never happens that way, because as a writer, you know that so much of who you are somehow gets into that book. You know, and I think I like getting into a book through the back door. You know, for me it works.
So you don't necessarily, you know, outline an A to Z that this is going to be what my next book is.
No, and I don't even do that with the book. I don't outline at all. I always have felt, I've always written in the same way that I've written poetry. It's a line comes to me. I hear a voice, mm-hmm. A piece of dialogue, a description of a character, and then I just begin. I just start writing from there and hope that it all comes together. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I not to say that there isn't any outline. There's one in my mind, you know, I'm thinking of, oh, this is going to happen next, or I need to get this in, or maybe the outline is you have the beginning and you have the end, but you have nothing in between.
Fill in the
which was pretty much Samurai's Garden. I knew he was going to get off the train in the beginning of the book. I knew he was going to get on leave at the end of the book. And because because I started out as the film major, I had that kind of, I think I have that kind of cinematic way of looking at something.
How stories are told.
Yeah.
Just let's touch on the American Kid. Who did you read? What were the books when you were a kid that
Kid growing up.
really excited you?
You know, I was fortunate because I had a mother who was a great reader, and she read all the translations of the classics, and it was translated into Chinese, and always talked about it. You know, and so I, of course, fell madly in love with Jane Austen, because what girl doesn't, right?
I hear,
yeah. And read all of the Jane Austens and the Brontes, and you know, so I started out very much with a classical reading background, of reading everybody forward, and then just devoured everything, Shakespeare, everything, you know, thinking, how did he do that? How did he get all this angst into, you know, and always was interested in the way you put plots and how the characters reacted to things. You know, and so I think I took a lot of that with me, and I always tell young writers that you can't write if you don't read, you know, and I think it's such a big part of my background as a writer that I can't say that enough. You know, and again, I was spending so much time in libraries as a kid, just because I would check out all these books, read them, bring them back, check out more books, you know, and it was a constant thing. Yeah.
That's an interesting value of libraries. There's the excitement as a kid to go to the library and have access to all these materials, but then being able to take them home with you, and you know, when it's bedtime and you get in bed and you crack that book open that you were so excited to pull off the shelf, it has value in so many different places in your life. It's not just in the library experience itself.
Yeah, I mean, there is that excitement that I think you get from a book that I'm trying to think if there's anything that equaled it as a kid growing up. You know, whenever I had a new book by an author whom I really liked, you know, you find one author, you like that author, and then you start reading all the books. Yeah. And every time you discovered somebody brought back another one of their books that you hadn't read yet, it was really something that I don't think anything equals it to a large extent. That kind of feeling.
Many times in my life, the highlight of the day or the week is to take that new book that by that author whose voice you've grown to love so much, and find the place in town that has the best cappuccino, and to spend an hour.
You can read at a cafe?
I can read on BART trains.
You're good.
I can read with headphones on. But back to this book, The Street of a Thousand Blossoms. You've covered different eras and cultural sort of starting points. This book starts just before World War II,
yes,
and then goes past the end of the war.
Yeah.
Fascinating time and place in Japan.
Yes.
How did what were the origins of this? This book was published in 2008. I believe. 2007. So when did you start on this book?
Well, you know, I think what I find one subject matter that I fall in love with, I should say. And I always equated writing a book was like a marriage. You know, I mean, there are times when you get in the fights and you want to divorce that book, but you can't because you're involved, right? So you stay with it. And that process goes back and forth with the book. And you have to find a topic that you love enough, or that you're curious enough that you can stay with for the time that it takes to finish the book. For me, I was always fascinated with the sumo culture. And I don't know why. I think every book kind of crosses the line of some kind of subculture that I've been fascinated with. The silk workers, the idea of illness in some of the books. And in this book, it was the sumo culture. People who stand apart from the normal society, but still are able to function and live and make a life and, you know, become something in their lives. And that's always fascinated me. And I think Thousand Blossoms started with that premise again. Sumo culture, what is that about? How do they get so big? What do they eat? Are they born that heavy? You know, I mean, if it wasn't for that kind of curiosity, I don't think I would have started this particular book. So it had been brewing for many years. It was just a topic that I wondered if anybody would want to read about, other than myself. At the same time, I knew it was a subject matter I wanted to write about, regardless. You know, which is kind of scary as a writer. You're thinking, what I would hope is that if I can write a good enough story, somebody will want to read this, even if it was about a beaver, you know, or about a big sumo man. So I began, and actually Thousand Blossoms began in the second part. It's divided into 3 parts. And when I first began the book, it started at part 2. And it was just when the young man was going to enter the sumo stable, which is pretty much like the training ground for sumo. And then I started asking myself questions. And this is the writing process pretty much. Well, wait a sec. How did he get there? Was he always good at sumo? Where did he learn sumo? You know, you start asking yourself these questions that you know a reader will ask. And I'm thinking, well, either I have to answer all these questions in backstory or flashbacks, or I have to set the book back in time. Mm-hmm. If I set the book back in time, I'm suddenly crossing World War II from a Japanese perspective, and that added a whole new kind of pressure as a writer. I'd never written from that point of view, for one, and now suddenly I was going to be, and I'd always written about World War II, but not from the Japanese point of view. And so I was a bit nervous about that. And suddenly all the information about the sumo, about the culture, kind of fell to the side. It wasn't as scary anymore. It was how was I going to translate the voices of the characters who actually lived through the firestorm, you know, who were actually everything opposite of what I grew up learning about. Mm-hmm. And that was what I had to take to task. I think every book has given a different kind of an assignment for me as a writer, to learn more, to grow a little more. And for this book, it was certainly the fact that I was writing it about a period of time that I hadn't lived in from a point of view that was so different from my own.
Wow. Yeah. What an amazing place and time to find yourself
stumbling through.
Magnetized to. Now here's something, these books take years of craft, of hard work, of you going back to read it as a reader and edit your work, and then to go through the editing process. So 2007, the book comes out. 2010, Walnut Creek picks it as the One City, One Book, and people who might not have known of the book pick it up and read it for the first time. What has been your experience connecting with your readers as far as, you know, books that you worked on that were so in your consciousness years ago, and now you've moved on and you're working on a different story, and somebody comes to you and says that they just had this experience with this book and they want to ask you a question, or they want to just respond. What's that like? I mean, the life of the work is so fascinating, because to that reader it's brand new and alive in their hands, and to you it's something that you've maybe moved on from, but it's a long-winded question, but
no, I mean, all the books you feel a certain degree of closeness, and then you move away from them. A common question that I always get is, what's your favorite book? And I'm thinking, oh, they're like kids.
Your favorite child.
Yeah, you can't say, oh, I like Sheila better than Harry for any reason. I think you write a book at a time in your life when you need, for some reason, to tell that particular story. And all the books have gone through that process for me. So there is always the attachment to every book for different reasons. Some a little more than others at certain times of the day, kind of thing. But the real beauty of a book is when you see on the face of a reader that somehow that book not only affected me as the writer, but affected them as the reader. You know, that they can somehow understand that these characters live in a place and time that's so far away from here, Walnut Creek, El Cerrito, wherever we are, present day, and yet they still understand them. They understand the way they think. They understand how they lived. And as the writer, that's what I hope for. It's like, can I bring a whole different lifestyle, a whole different culture, and make here and now understand what that's about? And if I can do it, then I've done my job as the writer. And when a reader comes and said, oh, that book changed my life, I don't know if that's really true, but you know, if it changes at that moment a way they think about another culture, a way they look at life, then I feel like, yes, I've done it. And that never goes away. You know, that's what you always hope to do as a writer.
And that's a very eloquent description of why it's important to keep picking up a book and engrossing yourself in reading, and log off the narcissism that is Facebook, which we were talking about before the interview started. So The Street of a Thousand Blossoms is your most recent published novel.
Yes.
But you've you're just wrapping up the next book. Can you
I'm-
tell us a little
I'm-
bit about it?
Actually, yeah, stepping in towards, I'm back in China in the late 1950s. And the book is titled 100 Flowers. You see blossoms, flowers, I can't get away. And it's the very, very start of the Cultural Revolution. There was one event that happened that started it all that not a lot of people know about, in the same sense that they know about the Cultural Revolution during the 60s. So it's this one event that affects a family there.
Well, it should be fascinating, as all your books are so beautifully written. Thank you so much for coming in to
Thank
the
you.
Walnut Creek Library and for spending some time. Just really, really interesting to hear about your process. And thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your body of work. You're a real gem as far as for the literary community, and certainly for the East Bay. And thanks to you, the viewers, for tuning in to Get Lit. Please tune in for more fascinating interviews with authors. Thanks to Gail Tsukiyama for coming in. Tune in to Get Lit, and we'll see you here at the Walnut Creek Library.